Jerry, I'm predicting that President Obama is going to try to dismantle the Small Business Administration and every federal program to help small businesses, I would say within 6 months. So as opposed to helping small businesses like he should be doing, I think he's going to harm small businesses and federal small business programs.
You think he's going to dismantle the SBA?
I do.
We already know that the credit crisis that's emerged from our largest financial institutions is becoming a credit crunch for small business owners, homeowners, and students seeking loans in big cities and small towns across the country.
Oh, he sounds on top of his game, but regardless of his vocal commitments, President Obama has just put small businesses on the back burner. He recently announced plans to dismantle the Small Business Administration, or SBA, by combining it with the Department of Commerce. Ironic that the government would merge the SBA with an agency that represents the nation's largest corporate giants. Well, it's not just irony. You see, reports and investigations have been surfacing in the last couple of years that have exposed the inside workings of a fraudulent system. What a shock. To talk now about what's really going on here, I'm joined by someone who's been researching this issue for many years, Lloyd Chapman. He's the president of the American Small Business League. Lloyd.
I first became concerned that President Obama might try to permanently close the Small Business Administration and end all federal small business programs when I was working on his campaign, actually. There was a fundraiser for President Obama not too far from my house, and I went, and I think it was one of the major sponsors of the event because I got to talk to him with a small group of people for about 45 minutes. And I talked to him about my concern about the government giving small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms, and he said, that was wrong and he would do something about that. And then later on the day, towards the end of the day actually, he was out in the garden of this house, and I talked to him, and there's a picture of me talking to him. He's got his hand just getting ready to go on my shoulder. And I said, by the time you're elected president, I will have done 100 radio shows telling people what a great president you're going to be.
The American Small Business League has endorsed Senator Barack Obama for president. President and founder Lloyd Chapman joins the show to talk about why they endorse Obama and what his stance is on small business. And you can go to asbl.com. And let's welcome Lloyd back. Lloyd, good to have you back.
Thanks, Jay. How you doing?
I'm doing good. All right, why the endorsement of Barack Obama and not Hillary Clinton?
Well, that's a good question. Number one, he's the only presidential candidate that's come out and has supported small businesses and specifically talked about issues about small businesses. And in particular, Senator Obama has come out and said he's against the diversion of federal small business contracts to Fortune 500 corporations.
Prior to the fundraiser, I'd been working on his campaign, and I would do radio shows talking about, President Obama. And I would do drive time radio shows on the East Coast. Of course, I'm in California. So I would get up at like 4 o'clock in the morning and sit on the floor in my living room in my pajamas and do these radio shows and, campaigning for Obama. He invited me to join his Small Business Advisory Committee. I think there's about 15 people on it, and it was on the telephone. And once a week we'd have this big conference call and, try to determine what would be President Obama's small business agenda when he was elected. And the two things that I pushed was, number one, not giving small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms, which I thought was a no-brainer, and getting rid of the Pentagon's comprehensive subcontracting plan test program, which was a huge loophole that allowed the Pentagon's largest prime contractors to completely circumvent the Small Business Act and not have to work with small businesses. So we worked on that for a number of months, and finally this big group of people agreed on the agenda. My two proposals were on there, and I was very happy about that. And just before the election, I think it was about a week before the election, they disbanded the Small Business Advisory Committee, and they rejected all of our proposals. And I thought not giving small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms was kind of a no-brainer that everybody would agree with. And I got worried at that point in time. I also worked with his campaign to get him to come out with a statement opposing the diversion of federal small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms. And he put out this statement about small businesses, how important they were to the economy, and most Americans work for small businesses. And it ended with a statement, and it's time to end the diversion of federal small business contracts to corporate giants. And about 48 hours after that came out on his website, they took off that last sentence. And that's when I really kind of knew that there was going to be a problem.
During the campaign, we heard President Obama, then Senator Obama, get a powerful endorsement from the American Small Business League. At the time, President Obama said small business is the backbone of the economy, and that it's time to end the diversion of government contracts out of Washington to corporate giants and make sure that they go to small businesses across the country. 2 months ago, the Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, reiterated that position. My guest today says the president has not only not lived up to that promise, but Lloyd Chapman, the American Small Business League's president, says the president lied.
He wouldn't even endorse the notion that we should stop giving small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms. I realized, so I was very disappointed. And I came out in 2008 and predicted that before the end of his presidency, he would try to permanently close the Small Business Administration, as Ronald Reagan did, by combining the SBA and the Department of Commerce. And sure enough, in 2012, he came out and announced he was going to do that. His rationale for trying to close the SBA is to save $300 million a year. Well, that's ridiculous. At the same time, he's going to propose to close the SBA to save $300 million. He's going to spend $7 billion to build power plants in Africa, and literally trillions of dollars are unaccounted for at the Pentagon and the Federal Reserve. So it's ludicrous to close the only agency in America to help the 28 million small businesses that create over 90% of the net new jobs for $300 million. So, I got lucky, and I was talking to some journalists and my staff, we're talking to journalists, and an article came out in Forbes, and the journalist said, I agree with Lloyd Chapman when he warns this is just another attempt to shutter one of the only government agencies in place to help the nation's nearly 30 million small business owners. And about, I would say, within 24 hours after that story came out, he appointed a new head of the SBA. Now, the SBA had been without an administrator for over a year. So 24 hours after that story came out, boom, Maria Contreras-Sweet was appointed head of the SBA, and he did not mention combining the SBA with the Department of Commerce after that for about 2 years. And it wasn't until his 2016 budget that he came out again and said he was going to combine the SBA with the Department of Commerce. And of course, that was Ronald Reagan's plan to permanently close the agency and end all federal programs. That was Senator Burr's plan to close the SBA.
On behalf of President Reagan, Mr. Stockman has already mixed it up with the farmers and the military. Today, he defended the president's decision to do away with the Small Business Administration.
New legislation proposed by Republican Senator Richard Burr of North Carolina would eliminate all federal programs to assist small businesses. It's called the Department of Commerce and Workforce Consolidation Act, and it will combine the Small Business Administration with the Departments of Labor and Commerce. So would this be bad news for job creation? Lloyd Chapman is the president of the American Small Business League.
When two Republicans wanted to permanently close the Small Business Administration and end all federal programs for small businesses, their plan was to combine with the Department of Commerce. That makes sense. The Department of Commerce is run by Fortune 500 firms, and they want 100% of all government contracts. And the only way to get that is to close the SBA and eliminate that federal law and those policies that mandate that 23% of all government contracts go to small businesses. So, yeah, if you want to close the SBA and give every penny the government spends to Fortune 500 firms, combined with the Department of Commerce, that's a great plan. The funny thing to me is that he calls it streamlining government. Well, that's not true. That's a lie. He's claiming he's going to save $300 million a year by combining the SBA and the Commerce Department. In the federal budget, that's peanuts. At the same time, he's increasing foreign aid by $9 billion. That's enough money to run the SBA for a decade. So the SBA's budget is 1/10,000th of 1% of the federal budget. You can't streamline government by closing the smallest agency in Washington, right? You can go on your computer and find stories about trillions unaccounted for at the Pentagon. The day before 9/11, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld said 2.3 trillion was unaccounted for. That was before we attacked Iraq and Afghanistan. I saw one story that says it's up to 8 trillion right now. But let's just be conservative and say trillions are unaccounted for at the Pentagon. So if I was president and I want to streamline government, I would look, for the biggest hole, right? And the biggest, hole is the Pentagon. That's where most of the government budget is spent, and that's where all the abuse is, and fraud and waste. You would never look at the little Mickey Mouse SBA. So the notion of streamlining government by closing the SBA is just not true. So in President Obama's State of the Union address, he talked about folks and middle-class families and people getting their fair share and everybody playing by the same rules and trying to find ways to help middle-class families, right? And middle-class economics. So let's talk about middle-class economics. U.S. Census Bureau data says there's 28 million small businesses in America. They say 98% of all U.S. firms have less than 100 employees. And those small businesses are responsible for over 90% of the net new jobs. Let me say that again. Over 90% of the net new jobs. About 4 or 5 years ago, the Kauffman Foundation did a study and said 100% of net new jobs come from new companies. Well, there's very few new Fortune 500 firms. I think you'll agree with that. You know, probably 99% of the new companies are small businesses, right? You can't deny the fact that the overwhelming majority of net new jobs come from small businesses. Also, the Census Bureau data shows us that small business is responsible for over half of the gross domestic product, over 50% of the private sector workforce, and over 90% of U.S. exporters. So America is a small business economy. Politicians always talking about creating jobs. Well, if small business is responsible for over 90% of the net new jobs, you want to create jobs, sounds to me like you need to do something with small businesses. Have you noticed how all the economic stimulus programs have directed money to Fortune 500 firms and the banks? Quite frankly, they'll say you can't get there from here. Yeah, you can't create jobs by giving money to banks or Fortune 500 firms. Yeah, large corporations are not creating jobs. In fact, they're shipping jobs overseas. And they're not paying their taxes. There's been a number of stories about that. I remember seeing a story just a couple of years ago. You're talking Fortune 500 firms that are making billions of dollars and paying zero federal income tax, right? Most Americans work for small businesses. Over 90% of net new jobs are created by small businesses in the middle class. And it would be economic suicide to close the SBA. And make no mistake, when President Obama comes out and talks about streamlining government, you'll notice his plan to streamline government is the exact same plan that Ronald Reagan had to close the SBA.
Ronald Reagan actually tried to close the SBA twice back in his administration, and the way he was going to close it was to combine it with the Commerce Department. So make no mistake, President Obama's intention to combine the SBA with the Commerce Department is the same thing that Ronald Reagan was going to try to do and close the agency, and then all the programs for the small businesses where most Americans work, and as you stated, over 90% of the net new jobs are created.
I could tell that the Obama administration was really amping up their game to close the SBA when Terry Sutherland showed up at the SBA. And this was a very high-level Pentagon PR guy. I call him a PR hitman. In fact, I call him Commander Cover-Up. That's my name for him. And when I saw him very quietly take over the SBA press office, I knew that they were, stepping up their game. Within a few months, here's what happened to me after Terry Sutherland showed up at the SBA. I got an email from Business Wire. And without any explanation, Business Wire said, we're no longer going to accept your press releases. No explanation, no justification, just no. And of course, if you look at my last few press releases on Business Wire, they're all talking about Obama's going to close the SBA. Then a couple of weeks after that, I got an email from Huffington Post. And they said, we're no longer going to run your blogs. No explanation. They refused to give me any explanation. I even wrote an open letter to Arianna Huffington. I put it on a national press release. No explanation. Look at my last few Huffington Post blogs. I think 6 of the last 10 are talking about Obama closing the SBA. The next thing that happened was the search results of my name on Google changed overnight. If you Google my name right now, in the autofill window, you won't see anything about Lloyd Chapman and the American Small Business League or ASBL. There's 1,000 stories on the internet that say Lloyd Chapman, American Small Business League, Lloyd Chapman, ASBL. It doesn't come up in the autofill. Now, if you search my name on Bing or Yahoo, it's just the opposite. Lloyd Chapman, American Small Business League, Lloyd Chapman, ASBL. So clearly, Google has modified the search results of my name to try to shut me up. And of course, Eric Schmidt, the former head of President Google, is a huge friend of Obama's, one of his biggest supporters. Google, I think, and the Google executives and their employees were the 3rd largest contributors to the Obama campaign. The next thing that happened is YouTube deleted over a dozen of my national television appearances that I'd put on YouTube. And guess what? They were me talking about Obama closing the SBA. So about a month ago, I started thinking about something, and I went on the internet and started looking at it. And Business Wire, that mysteriously won't run my press releases, is owned by Warren Buffett, who was one of the original contributors to Obama's campaign. He's the guy that really got Obama the funds to run for president in the first place. And then Huffington Post dropped me as a blogger. Well, Time Warner bought the Huffington Post, and the president of Time Warner is a huge backer of President Obama's. And then, of course, the Google anomaly where the search results of my name were changed, and Eric Schmidt is a huge friend of Obama's. And of course, then YouTube deletes my videos, which is owned by Google. So I call it Obama's billionaire buddies. Obama's billionaire buddies are trying to shut Lloyd Chapman up because I correctly predicted that he would try to permanently close the SBA using Ronald Reagan's 30-year plan by combining with the Department of Commerce. And President Obama doesn't like that.
According to an investigation by Democrats on the House Small Business Committee, last year a hefty $12 billion in federal contracts were given to, if you can believe it, names like Microsoft, Rolls-Royce, and Walmart, 2,500 big businesses in all. How can that happen? A big part of the problem is mega corporations somehow getting labeled as small on SBA lists or contract applications.
I think the real reason they want to close the SBA is to cover up the fraud. It sort of doesn't make sense to close it to save 1/10,000th of 1% of the federal budget. So what's the real reason? Well, let's see. Every year of the Obama administration, the Inspector General at the SBA that President Obama appointed, Peg Gustafson, has said the #1 problem at the SBA is the diversion of federal small business contracts to large businesses.
My office's reviews continue to identify procurement flaws that allow large firms to obtain small business awards. In fact, this issue is identified by my office as a top management challenge for the agency and has been for several years.
There have been over a dozen federal investigations that have found that small business contracts are being diverted to Fortune 500 firms and even some of the largest companies around the world, like Rolls-Royce and British Aerospace and Finmechanic in Italy. There have been a dozen investigative reports in the mainstream media.
A new report out tonight says billions of dollars in federal contracts meant to help small businesses are actually being awarded to some of the largest corporations in the world.
Under the law, nearly 1/4 of all federal contracts are supposed to go to small businesses, recognizing the fact that those small businesses make up the engine that drives our economy. But I-Team reporter Karen Anderson discovered the government is dropping the ball on this, allowing huge corporations to grab
tax
contracts
dollars
that
set
are
aside
meant
and
for
meant for small businesses, instead going to huge corporations, including dozens of big companies right here in Silicon Valley.
These aren't opinions. You can look in the federal procurement data system and see that every year for the last 5 or 6, 7, 8 years, when you look at the top 100 recipients, most of them are large businesses. I think the real reason they want to close the SBA is to cover up the fraud. They shouldn't be allowed to do that. It's just, it'll be a tragedy, and we shouldn't let them do it.
Alarming new evidence tonight of widespread fraud in a federal government program designed to give money to small businesses. Now, federal investigators say the Small Business Administration awarded contracts to businesses falsely claiming to be located in economically distressed areas. The agency even gave small business contracts to some of the country's biggest companies.
I saw a documentary on Netflix one night called The War on Whistleblowers. And as I watched the program, I recognized some of the things that were going on, and I realized that the Obama administration is treating me like a whistleblower. And when you watch that movie, The War on Whistleblowers, or if you go to Bing or Yahoo and search on Obama's War on Whistleblowers, you'll see that, #1, the Obama administration is the least transparent administration in history. The Obama administration receives fewer FOIA requests than the Bush administration, and yet they're denying more of them. And then all the journalists that I've been working with for a long time wouldn't return my phone calls anymore. That was actually particularly scary. I don't know what they said to them. But all the TV shows that I'd done, repeatedly wouldn't return my phone calls. All the journalists that I'd worked with. So my credibility has never been higher. For 30 years, Anytime somebody wants to close the SBA, they have one solution: combine it with the Commerce Department, give small businesses more money from the stimulus. And I think the number one thing they could do is shift federal infrastructure spending to small businesses. Congress's approval rate would be like, 0%. If President Obama wants to create jobs, it's real simple, it's easy. He needs to take existing federal spending and direct it to small businesses. Federal law says 23% of all government contracts should go to small businesses. It's not miscoding, it's intentional. And then in many cases, it's outright federal contracting fraud. This is part of a pattern that you see in Washington of what I call anti-small business policies.
Now, we're constantly told by politicians that small businesses are the backbone of the American economy. And by federal law, the government is required to give 23% of contracts to small businesses. But the reality is that the system has been rigged. Just between 2012 and 2013, over 200 Fortune 500 companies were the ones receiving these federal small business contracts. And this problem has existed for years, but isn't being addressed. Joining us now is Lloyd Chapman, the president and founder of the American Small Business League.
They want to permanently close the SBA, and I think we all know that Fortune 500 firms have tremendous power in Washington. The American people have no power in Washington as far as I can tell, quite frankly. It's the Fortune 500 firms, right? And look at TARP and the American Reinvestment Recovery Act. That all went to big businesses, right? Again, the notion of trying to stimulate the economy by giving billions of dollars to big businesses is just absurd. So the SBA is the only federal agency ever created to help the middle class and small businesses. And I think small businesses and middle class are synonymous. The middle class is small business. There's no middle class Fortune 500 firms, right? And there's no small businesses that are Fortune 500 firms. So to me, middle class and small business are virtually the same. So if we're trying to reduce the income inequality and create jobs and stimulate the economy, you got to do it with small businesses. Well, what's the largest federal program in the history of America to help small businesses in the middle class? Well, that would be the Small Business Act. And that law says a minimum of 23% of all government contracts should go to small businesses. I think that's the most efficient, effective economic stimulus program in U.S. history. What better way, to invest our tax dollars and to reinvest them with the small business where most Americans work, where 90% of the jobs come from, half the gross domestic product and half the private sector workforce, over 90% of U.S. exporters, right?
Lloyd Chapman is head of the nonpartisan American Small Business League. He says Obama's new plan ignores a series of federal investigations that found the government guilty of giving billions of dollars in small business contracts to huge Fortune 500 companies.
If he would reaffirm his commitment to stop the flow of government small business contracts to corporate giants, as he said, that would have a much bigger impact on the middle class economy than anything he's proposed so far. Closing the SBA would be a travesty. It would be economic suicide. It would pull over $100 billion a year in federal contracts from the middle class, and no telling how many loans. But so the Fortune 500 firms want every penny the government spends. They've been lobbying since Reagan was president to close the SBA. You can't get all the money if the law says 23% goes to small businesses, right? So Fortune 500 firms are lobbying to close the SBA. The Commerce Department is the agency of Fortune 500 firms. It's the antithesis of the SBA, right? And so to combine the SBA with the Department of Commerce would be absurd. It's like combining NASA and the U.S. Forestry Service, right? A series of failed investigations has shown that every year for, I think, 12 years, Fortune 500 firms are getting federal small business contracts. The largest recipient of federal small business contracts for FY 2014 was Verizon. So think about turning over small business programs to a federal agency that's controlled by the Fortune 500 firms that have been hijacking the small business contracts and lobbying to close it. The SBA is the only agency in our government to help the companies where most Americans work, where 90% of the jobs are created. The only agency that helps the middle class. Politicians talk about the middle class and creating jobs and stimulating the economy. The SBA, that's the agency that stimulates the economy and creates jobs. The notion of streamlining the government by closing the SBA is just ridiculous. And if they do, it's going to be a huge, huge mistake. It's unfortunate that all the groups that claim to represent small businesses don't, and you can tell by the fact that they're not saying a word about President Obama's plan to close the only agency in the history of America that was specifically created to help small businesses. But I'm going to keep shooting my mouth off in every way that I possibly can. You know, blogs, press releases. I'm going to try to get back on television and warn people what's going to happen. If they close the SBA, the only agency in the history of America to help the middle class, it'll be devastating to the middle class economy. It'll be devastating, and it's kind of shocking, by the way, that I'm the only person in the country that's really objecting to Obama's plan to close America's middle class agency, the SBA.